Abigail Hart's hand was shaking so hard she nearly dropped the money. $40. Every cent she had left in the world crumpled inside her father's old handkerchief. The auctioneer looked at her like she'd lost her mind. The whole crowd laughed, but she didn't care. She walked past the prize stallions, past the mockery, straight to the pen nobody wanted to look at, and she bought the horse everyone said was already dead. She didn't know it yet, but that horse was about to save everything she had left to lose. If you're watching this from a small town that people forget about. 2. Tell me where you're from in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if stories like this speak to you, hit subscribe and stay with me till the end, because Abigail's story is only just beginning. The gavel came down like a gunshot, and Abigail Hart flinched every time, even though she'd heard it 100 times that morning. Lot after lot. Cattle after cattle. Pieces of her father's life sold off to strangers who wouldn't even remember his name by supper. Sold to the gentleman in the gray hat. Another 20 head gone. 20 head that used to graze the north pasture when her father was alive, when the Hart Ranch meant something in this county, when people tipped their hats when she rode into town instead of turning their backs. She stood at the edge of the crowd with her arms crossed tight over her chest, like she could hold herself together that way. Dust coated her boots. Sweat stuck her dress to her back. And still she stood straight, because her father had taught her that a heart never let anybody see her break, not even when everything was breaking around her. Well, look who decided to show her face. Abigail didn't have to turn around to know that voice. Victor Harlan's voice had a way of crawling under her skin like a tick, slow and patient, and certain it would get what it wanted eventually. She turned anyway. Better to face him than let him talk to her back. Mr. Harlan? Miss Hart. He tipped his hat, but there wasn't a lick of respect in the gesture. There never was. Come to watch the rest of your daddy's legacy go under the hammer. Came to see it sold fair, nothing more. Fair. He said the word like it tasted bad in his mouth. There's nothing fair about a woman running a ranch twice the size of what she can handle. Your daddy knew that. Guess that's why he worked himself into an early grave trying to prove otherwise. Something hot flared up behind Abigail's ribs, but she swallowed it down. She'd learned that lesson already 3 months ago, standing over her father's fresh grave, while half the county whispered behind their hands about how the Hart Ranch wouldn't last the winter without a man to run it. My father built something out of nothing, she said low and even. Something you've been trying to buy out from under me since the day they lowered him into the ground. I'm trying to save you from ruin Miss Hart. There's a difference. Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. It never did. But you're too proud to see a helping hand when it's offered. Your hands never offered anything that didn't cost me the deed to my land. A few heads turned. People loved this, the widow's daughter, and the richest man in 3 counties squaring off in the middle of a cattle auction like it was Sunday entertainment. Abigail could feel their eyes crawling over her, and she hated every single one of them for it. Ladies and gentlemen, Victor said, raising his voice just enough to make sure the crowd heard him. Maybe we ought to have a moment of silence for the Hart Ranch. Seems like it's dying a slow death piece by piece right here in this auction ring. Laughter. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to make her face burn. Abigail's jaw tightened. The ranch isn't dead yet, Mr. Harlan. No, he agreed, stepping close enough that only she could hear the next part. But it will be. And when it is, I'll be the one standing there to pick up the pieces. You can sell to me now with some dignity left, or you can wait until the bank forecloses and I buy it for pennies from them instead. Either way, that land ends up mine. Over my dead body. That can be arranged too if it comes to it. He smiled wider like he'd made a joke, but his eyes said otherwise. 90 days, Miss Hart. That's what the bank gave you. 90 days to find $700 or that land you're so proud of belongs to whoever holds the note. And we both know who's been buying up every note in this county. He walked away before she could answer, boots kicking up dust, leaving her standing there with her fists clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms. 90 days, $700. $43 in her pocket, and every head of cattle she had left already promised to the bank. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run after Victor Harlan and slap that smug look clean off his face. Instead, she took a breath the way her father used to, before he made a hard decision, and she turned toward the pens at the far end of the auction grounds, where the last few lots waited the ones nobody wanted, the leftovers, the culls. She didn't know why she walked that way. Maybe just to get away from the crowd. Maybe because looking at something more broken than herself made her feel less alone in it. That's where she saw him. The horse stood in the corner of a run-down pen, head low, ribs showing through a coat the color of old ash. One back leg favored held up slightly off the ground. Scars crossed his flank, old ones, the kind that came from being worked too hard by somebody who never cared if he lived past it. Nobody was even bidding on him. The auctioneer barely glanced his way. "That one there, folks, is more trouble than he's worth," the auctioneer called out half-hearted, like he already knew nobody was listening. "Lame in the back leg ornery as sin bit 2 handlers already this week. Do I hear $5 just to get him off the grounds?" Silence. $4? More silence. A man near the front spat into the dirt. "Ought to just shoot him and save everybody the trouble," someone muttered loud enough to carry. Abigail felt something twist in her chest. The horse lifted his head at the sound of the voices just slightly, like he understood exactly what they were saying about him, and had simply run out of the strength to care. $3 then. Somebody. Anybody. She didn't decide to raise her hand. Her arm just went up on its own like it belonged to someone braver than her. $40. The auctioneer blinked. The whole crowd turned. "I'm sorry, miss." $40, Abigail said again, louder this time, steadier than she felt. "I'll give you $40 for him." Somebody laughed outright. A woman near the fence shook her head like she'd witnessed the saddest thing she'd seen all week. Abigail heard Victor Harlan's voice somewhere behind her, low and delighted. "There she goes again. $40 for a dead horse. Guess desperation makes fools of us all. That horse ain't worth $4, ma'am, let alone 40? The auctioneer said, not unkindly, more confused than anything. "You sure about this?" Abigail looked at the horse. Really looked at him. Past the ribs and the scars and the way he flinched when a man walked too close to the fence. She looked at his eyes instead, and something in them wasn't broken. It was waiting. She didn't know how to explain that to a man holding a gavel in front of a laughing crowd. "I'm sure," she said. $40, that's my offer." "Sold better," the auctioneer said, mostly just to end the spectacle. To the lady with more heart than sense. More laughter. Abigail didn't care. She walked to the pen with her father's handkerchief still clutched in one hand. $40, nearly everything she had left in this world, folded inside it, and she held it out to the man collecting payment like it was the most natural thing she'd ever done. "You're really taking him?" the handler asked, eyeing her like she'd sprouted a second head. "Ma'am, I ought to warn you he's near unmanageable. Kicked a stall door clean off its hinges 2 nights back." "I heard. And that leg ain't gonna heal right. Vet already looked at him. Said it's a coin flip whether he even walks sound again." "I heard that too." The handler shook his head, took her money, and opened the gate. "Your funeral, I suppose." Abigail stepped into the pen slow, the way her father taught her to move around a spooked animal. No sudden motions, no fear in her shoulders, even if her heart was hammering. The horse's ears pinned back. He shifted his weight, favoring the bad leg, watching her with an eye that had learned the hard way not to trust anybody wearing boots. "Easy," she murmured. "Easy now, I'm not here to hurt you." He snorted, stamped once, warning her off. "I know," she said softly, like she was talking to a person instead of an animal. "I know everybody's told you that before. I know you got no reason to believe me." She didn't reach for him. She just stood there, hand loose at her side, letting him take his time deciding what kind of person she was. "My daddy used to say," she went on, voice cracking just slightly, "that the animals nobody wants are usually the ones who just haven't found the right person yet. I don't know if that's true. I don't know much of anything right now, if I'm honest with you. I just lost my daddy. I'm about to lose my home. And every single person in this town looked at me today like I was already finished." The horse's ears flicked toward her, listening despite himself. "So maybe I'm foolish," Abigail whispered. "Buying a horse I can't afford that might not even walk right again when I got 90 days to find $700 or lose everything my father built. Maybe I am a fool." She took one slow step closer. "But I looked at you in that pen, and everybody around us was already writing you off, already decided you weren't worth saving. And I know exactly what that feels like." The horse didn't move away this time. "So we're going to figure this out together," she said. "You and me, whatever that looks like." Behind her, she heard boots crunching in the dirt, and she turned to find Victor Harlan leaning against the fence rail, watching the whole exchange with an expression somewhere between amusement and pity. "Talking to horses now, Miss Hart. Won't be long before folks start saying you've lost your mind entirely." "Get off my fence, Mr. Harlan." "It's not your fence. Not yet anyway, but soon enough." He pushed off the rail, unhurried, savoring every word. 90 days. "Tell you what, I'll even throw in a little extra time out of the kindness of my heart if you sell now instead of dragging this out. No sense torturing yourself over pride." "You don't have a kind heart, Mr. Harlan. You've got a ledger where one ought to be." That finally wiped the smile off his face just for a second. "You'll regret talking to me like that." "I regret a lot of things," Abigail said. "Buying this horse isn't going to be one of them." He looked at the horse, then at her, and shook his head like he was looking at something pitiful. $40 for a dying animal, while your father's ranch burns down around your ears. That's not stubbornness, Miss Hart. That's madness." "Then I reckon I'm mad," she said. "Now get off my land, what's left of it, before I have you removed." Victor laughed low and cold and touched the brim of his hat in something that wasn't quite a bow. 90 days, he reminded her. One last time, then walked off toward his waiting carriage boots, kicking up dust that drifted over the pen like a warning. Abigail turned back to the horse. He hadn't moved, hadn't spooked at the raised voices the way she expected. If anything, he seemed to be studying her now, head tilted slightly, that wounded leg still held careful off the ground. "Well," she said, letting out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Guess it's just us now." She didn't have rope. She didn't have a wagon to haul him home in, not with the leg he was favoring. She had 40 fewer dollars than she'd started the day with, 90 days on a debt she had no earthly idea how to pay, and a half-starved horse that the whole county had already decided was worthless. And still walking him slow, out of that pen, past the crowd that watched her with open mouths and shaking heads, Abigail Hart felt something she hadn't felt in 3 months since she buried her father. She felt like she'd done something right. She didn't know yet how right. She didn't know that the horse, limping beside her, carried something in his blood that not even Victor Harlan's money could buy. She didn't know that within 3 months, this same crowd that laughed at her today would be standing in stunned silence, watching her cross a finish line nobody thought she'd reach. All she knew walking down that dusty road with a dying man's daughter and a dying horse, both of them written off by everyone who'd ever looked at them, was that she wasn't ready to give up. Not on the ranch, not on her father's memory, and not on the animal walking beside her who flinched at every sudden movement, but hadn't not once tried to pull away from her hand resting light against his neck. Somewhere behind her the auction was already moving on to the next lot. Her humiliation, already old news, replaced by fresh gossip and fresh laughter. Somewhere ahead of her 90 days were already ticking down toward a debt she had no way to pay. But right here in this moment, there was just a woman and a horse walking home together in the fading light. Neither one of them broken all the way through, no matter what everybody else believed. Abigail didn't sleep that night. She sat outside the barn with a lantern burning low, watching the gray horse pace the small pen she'd cobbled together from broken fence rails, and every time he came near the water trough, he'd stop, sniff at it, and back away like it might bite him. "You gotta drink something," she said, voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Can't fix a leg on an empty stomach and no water in you." The horse pinned his ears and turned his hindquarters toward her. the universal language of an animal that had learned hands only ever brought pain. "Fine," she muttered. "Be stubborn. We'll see who outlasts who." By sunrise, her back ached from sitting against the barn wall, and the horse still hadn't touched the water. She dragged herself up joints stiff and found the last heel of bread in the kitchen, softened it in a little milk, and carried it out to him in her open palm. He watched her the whole way across the yard, muscles bunched ready to bolt, except there was nowhere in that small pen left to bolt to. "I'm not your enemy," she said low, the way she'd talked to him yesterday. "I know that's hard to believe." He snorted, stamped his good leg. But when she held perfectly still, arm outstretched, bread balanced on her palm, he took one step forward. Then another. His nose hovered an inch from her hand, nostrils flaring deciding. Then he took the bread. Abigail nearly cried right there in the dirt. It was such a small thing. A starving horse taking a scrap of soaked bread, and yet it felt like the first honest victory she'd had in 3 months. "There," she whispered. "That's it. That's all I'm asking." She didn't get to enjoy the moment long. A wagon came rattling up the drive not 10 minutes later, and Abigail's stomach dropped when she recognized the driver, Mrs. Pruitt. The biggest gossip in 3 counties, and never in her life had she come around the Hart place without a reason that benefited nobody but herself. "Abigail Hart," the woman called out before she'd even set the brake. "Is it true what they're saying? That you spent your last dollar on a dying horse at the auction?" $40, Abigail said, wiping her hands on her skirt. "And it's not my last dollar. Might as well be way I hear it." Mrs. Pruitt climbed down, eyeing the horse in the pen with open disdain. "Lord have mercy, look at the state of that animal. You could count every rib from here." "He's healing." "He's dying is what he's doing, and you're wasting good feed on him while your own cattle go hungry." Mrs. Pruitt's eyes were bright with the particular hunger of a woman who couldn't wait to carry this story to the next port she visited. "Victor Harlan's telling everybody in town you've finally lost your senses. Says your daddy would be ashamed." Something in Abigail went very still and very cold. "You get off my land," she said quietly. "I only came to—" "You came to see the wreck for yourself, so you'd have something fresh to talk about at church on Sunday. Well, you've seen it. Now go." Mrs. Pruitt sniffed offended, but she climbed back up into her wagon fast enough. "You're going to lose everything, Abigail Hart. Everybody in town can see it but you." "Then everybody in town can mind their own business." The wagon rattled off, and Abigail stood there shaking not from fear this time, but from a fury so pure it nearly buckled her knees. She turned back to the horse who'd retreated to the far corner of the pen at the sound of raised voices, and she took a breath and another until her hands stopped trembling. "Don't you listen to a word of that," she told him. "Not one word." That afternoon, she went through what remained of her father's ledgers at the kitchen table, the numbers swimming in front of her tired eyes. $700. 90 days now, 89. 12 head of cattle left, and even selling every last one wouldn't cover half of what she owed. She put her head down on the table, and for just a moment let herself feel the full weight of it. Then a voice from the yard made her sit bolt upright. "Ma'am, sorry to intrude." She grabbed her father's old shotgun from beside the door before she even thought about it, and stepped out onto the porch to find a stranger standing at a respectful distance from the house, hat in his hands, a bay gelding tied loose behind him. He was maybe 30, sun-browned, with the kind of quiet stillness about him that made her second-guess pointing a gun his way, though she didn't lower it either. "State your business," she said. "Name's Caleb Morgan." He didn't flinch at the shotgun, didn't reach for anything, just stood there with his hat against his chest like he was in church. "I was passing through heading toward the Bitterroot country, and I saw the horse in your pen." "Lots of people have seen the horse. Most of them just laughed." "I didn't laugh, ma'am." Something in the way he said it made her lower the shotgun an inch. "What do you want, Mr. Morgan? Truth is, I spent some years up in the high country working mustangs, wild ones, the kind most folks wouldn't touch." He glanced toward the pen, and Abigail followed his gaze to see the gray horse standing at the fence line, watching the stranger with an intensity she hadn't seen in him before. Not fear exactly. Recognition, maybe. "That horse of yours ain't broken the way people think. I'd bet my saddle on it." "And what would you know about it? I know a horse that's given up looks different than one that's just waiting for somebody worth trusting." He nodded toward the gray. "That one there's still watching, still deciding. A horse that's truly broken, don't watch anymore. He'd have stopped caring a long time ago." Abigail lowered the shotgun the rest of the way, though she kept it in easy reach. "You said you were passing through." "I was. So why are you standing in my yard?" Caleb was quiet a moment, turning his hat slowly in his hands. "Guess I've got a soft spot for lost causes, ma'am. Comes from being one myself once." "That's supposed to convince me to trust a stranger on my property." "No, ma'am. Reckon nothing I say is going to convince you of that. Figured I'd just offer, and you can tell me to ride on if you'd rather." "Offer what exactly?" "My help. With the horse. No charge." He must have seen the suspicion still written plain across her face, because he added, "I don't need your money, Miss Hart, and I don't want your land. I just want to see if I'm right about that animal. And if you're wrong, then I'll saddle up and ride out, and you'll be no worse off than you are now." Abigail studied him a long moment. Everything in her wanted to send him packing, a strange man showing up out of nowhere, offering something for nothing, in a county full of people who wanted nothing more than to watch her fail. But she thought of the horse taking that scrap of bread from her palm, that flicker of something behind his eyes that wasn't quite fear, and she thought of 89 days ticking down toward ruin, and she found herself saying words she hadn't planned on saying at all. "You can look at him. That's all I'm promising." Caleb nodded like that was more than enough. "That's all I'm asking, ma'am." He didn't rush the pen the way most men would have. He stood outside the fence for a long while, just watching the horse watch him. Neither one moving like two old soldiers, sizing each other up across a battlefield. "What happened to his leg?" he finally asked. "Don't know exactly. Bought him as is. Vet at the auction said it might not heal right. Mind if I take a look? He'll bite you." "He might." Caleb agreed and climbed the fence anyway. Abigail's heart lurched into her throat as he crossed the pen, slow hands, loose shoulders relaxed in a way that seemed to say he had nowhere else in the world he needed to be. The horse's ears went back. He shifted his weight, teeth bared just slightly in warning. "Easy," Caleb murmured, and Abigail realized it was the exact same word she'd used the day before, the exact same tone. "I ain't here to hurt you, old son. Just want to see that leg." The horse snapped at him, teeth clicking shut inches from his shoulder. Caleb didn't even flinch. "Mr. Morgan." Abigail started alarmed. "He's testing me," Caleb said, calm as still water. "That's all. Man who's never been tested don't know who to trust." He kept talking low and steady nonsense, mostly just the sound of his voice filling the space between them, until slowly, impossibly, the horse's ears came forward again. Caleb crouched, ran a gentle hand down the injured leg, and the horse allowed it, standing rigid but still. "Old break," Caleb said after a minute, straightening up slow. "Healed wrong the first time, probably years back. Somebody worked him too hard on it before it set right. Can it be fixed? Not fixed exactly, but strengthened. Built up around if you're patient and you know what you're doing." He looked at her, then something sharp and certain in his eyes. "This ain't a broken-down call, Miss Hart. This is a horse that's been surviving on nothing but grit for longer than either of us probably know. You give him the right care, the right training, and I'd wager he outlasts every fancy stallion in this county." Abigail felt something shift in her chest, something she hadn't let herself feel since the auction. Hope, maybe, or the first thin edge of it. "Why should I believe you?" "You don't have to believe me yet," Caleb said. "Just give me a chance to prove it." That was the first mini-victory of many that week. Though Abigail didn't yet understand how many more were coming, each one small. Each one a brick laid against the wall of everything Victor Harlan and this whole gossiping county wanted to see collapse. Caleb came back the next morning, and the morning after that. He never asked for payment, never lingered in the house, never made her feel like his presence carried a price she'd have to pay later. He simply worked slow, patient, relentless work with the horse, teaching Abigail things her father had never had the chance to. "You're pulling too hard on the lead," he told her the fourth day, as she tried to guide the horse, who still hadn't earned a name in her mind, though she was starting to think of him as something more than the horse around the pen at a careful walk. "He ain't a dog. Pulling just tells him to fight you." "Then how am I supposed to—" "Give him slack. Let him choose to follow. A horse that follows because he wants to is worth 10 who follow because they're forced to." She let the lead go slack in her hand, and for a heart-stopping second, the gray horse simply stopped walking altogether, testing whether she'd yank him forward again. When she didn't, when she just stood there with the lead loose and her breath held, he took one hesitant step, then another. Following her, not because the rope demanded it, but because something else had. "There it is," Caleb said quietly, and Abigail thought she heard something like pride in his voice, though she couldn't have said if it was pride in the horse or in her. Word got around fast that a stranger was working on the Hart place. It was maybe a week later that Victor Harlan showed up himself uninvited, sitting tall on a black horse worth more than everything Abigail owned combined. "Heard you took in a drifter," Victor said, not bothering to dismount, looking down at both of them like they were something he'd scraped off his boot. "That true Miss Hart." "His name is Caleb Morgan," Abigail said, "and he's helping me with the horse. Not that it's any of your business. Everything on this land is my business sooner or later." Victor's eyes slid over to Caleb, sizing him up, and something flickered there that Abigail couldn't quite read, not quite recognition, but close to it. "Do I know you, mister?" "Don't believe so," Caleb said evenly. "You look familiar." "Lot of men look familiar out here." Victor held his gaze a beat too long, like he was trying to place a face from a memory he couldn't quite reach, and then he shook his head and turned back to Abigail. "Doesn't matter. You can hire whatever drifters you like, Miss Hart. Won't change the math. 82 days left, and that animal you're so proud of still can't walk a straight line." "He's healing. He's dying slow instead of dying fast. There's a difference, but it ain't the one you think." Victor's black horse shifted restlessly beneath him, sensing its rider's temper. "I'll tell you what, though. Since you seem so determined to embarrass yourself, I'm going to give this whole county something to really talk about." "What's that supposed to mean?" Victor smiled, slow and mean. "You'll find out soon enough. Enjoy your little project, Miss Hart. Won't matter much come the day I own this land." He rode off without waiting for a response, and Abigail stood there, fuming hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Man's got a real gift for making an exit," Caleb said dryly, and despite everything, despite the fear curdling in her stomach, Abigail almost laughed. "You know something about him," she said. "I saw it on your face." Caleb's jaw tightened just slightly. "Man like that makes enemies wherever he goes. I've heard the name before is all. Nothing more to it." She didn't believe him, not entirely, but she let it go, because there wasn't time to chase down every mystery when there was a debt clock ticking louder every single day. The days that followed blurred together into a rhythm of work sunrise to sunset hands, blistered and raw muscles aching in ways she'd never felt before. Caleb taught her to read the horse's ears, his tail, the set of his shoulders, until she could tell what he was feeling before he even moved. "He trusts you now," Caleb said, nearly 2 weeks in watching Abigail run a brush down the horse's flank while he stood calm and unbothered beside her. "More than he trusts me, if I'm honest. That means something. Means you earned it." Caleb leaned against the fence rail, watching the two of them with an expression Abigail couldn't quite place. "What are you going to call him? Can't keep saying the horse forever." Abigail considered the animal in front of her, the ash-gray coat, the way his eyes had gone from wary to something almost soft when she was near. "Ash," she said finally. "Like the color. Like something that survived a fire." "Ash?" Caleb repeated, nodding slow. "Fits him." That night, for the first time since her father died, Abigail slept a full 8 hours, and she woke to the sound of hooves in the yard that didn't belong to Ash or Caleb's gelding. She was out the door in her nightclothes before she'd even fully woken, and what she found stopped her cold. The north fence, the one holding what remained of her cattle, lay in splinters. 12 head, all she had left in the world besides the ranch itself, gone. Not a single animal in sight. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Caleb was already there, crouched by the broken fence rail, running his fingers over the wood. "This wasn't weather damage," he said grimly. "This was cut. Somebody took an axe to these posts." "Victor." Abigail breathed the name coming out like poison. "This was Victor Harlan." "Can't prove that." "I don't need proof. I know him." Her hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from a rage so total it felt like it might swallow her whole. "He said he'd give this county something to talk about. This is what he meant." They found the cattle 2 miles out, scattered along the ridge line, and it took the better part of the day to round them back exhausted and thirsty, and short 2 calves that had wandered into a ravine and broken their legs on the rocks. Abigail had to put them down herself, her father's revolver heavy and cold in her shaking hand, tears streaming down her face the whole time. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the animals, to her father, to herself. "I'm so sorry." Caleb found her afterward, sitting in the dirt with her knees pulled to her chest, and he didn't say anything at first. He just sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and let the silence stretch. "He's trying to break me," Abigail finally said, "piece by piece. First the auction, now this." "I know. You don't understand what it's like. Everybody in this county already thinks I'm finished. Every single person is just waiting for the day they get to say, 'I told you so.' I understand more than you think, Miss Hart." Something in his voice made her look up. There was a weight behind his eyes she hadn't noticed before. Something old and heavy that had nothing to do with cattle or fences or the here and now. "What happened to you?" she asked quietly. "Before you showed up in my yard talking about Mustangs and lost causes." Caleb was quiet a long moment, and Abigail thought he wouldn't answer at all. "I had a place once," he said finally. "Not far from here, land my father left me, and a man not so different from Victor Harlan decided he wanted it." He picked at a loose thread on his sleeve, not meeting her eyes. "Took him 3 years, but he got it. Bought up my debts, called them in all at once, and when I couldn't pay the bank, took everything. I watched my father's whole life get auctioned off to strangers who didn't even know his name." "Caleb, so when I saw you standing in that auction yard, buying a horse, everybody said was worthless, spending your last dollar on something that had nothing left to give anybody." He finally looked at her, and there was something raw and true in his expression. "I saw myself. Except I didn't fight hard enough back then. I let it go too easy. I've regretted it every day since." Abigail felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been sealed tight since her father's funeral. "So this isn't about the horse at all?" "It's about the horse," Caleb said. "But it's about more than that, too." They sat together in the dirt as the sun sank low, and for the first time since Victor Harlan had started circling her like a vulture over a dying animal, Abigail didn't feel entirely alone in the fight. But the fence had cost her something, too. Cost her time, cost her sleep, cost 2 calves she couldn't afford to lose. 80 days left, and she was further behind than ever. The next blow came from a direction she never expected. It was a bank clerk, not Victor himself, who delivered the news. 2 weeks later, a thin, nervous young man named Elliot Reyes, who wouldn't meet her eyes when he handed her the letter. "I'm sorry, Miss Hart," he said. "Truly I am. But the terms of the note have changed." Abigail's blood went cold as she read the paper in her hands. "This says I owe the full amount in 60 days, not 90. "The note was purchased," Elliot said miserably. "Bought outright from the bank by a private buyer. New terms came with the sale. Legal, unfortunately. I checked myself." "Who bought it?" Elliot's silence told her everything she needed to know before he even said the name. "Victor Harlan." The letter shook in her hands. 60 days, not 90. He'd found a way to strangle her faster, tighter, and there wasn't a single law in the territory that could stop him from doing it. There's something else. Elliot added quieter, now glancing over his shoulder, like he was afraid of being overheard even out here on her own porch. Mr. Harlan's announced something in town. A race, open to anyone in the county. Grand prize is enough money to clear any debt, any note, any mortgage, no matter the amount. Abigail's heart stumbled. What's the catch? You have to beat his horse to claim it. And the course? Elliot hesitated. It's not an easy ride, Miss Hart. Runs clean through the high canyon country, up through Widow's Ridge, down through Shale Pass. Men have died on trails easier than that one. Why would he offer something like that? Because he's certain nobody can win it, Elliot said simply. Especially not against his horse. Thunder's the finest animal in 3 territories, and Mr. Harlan knows it. He's not offering a chance, Miss Hart. He's offering a public humiliation with your name written all over it. After Elliot left, Abigail sat on the porch steps for a long time, the letter crumpled in her fist, 60 days pressing down on her chest like a stone. Caleb found her there at dusk, and she didn't have to say anything. She just handed him the letter. He read it twice, his face darkening with each line. 60 days. And a race I'm apparently supposed to enter against a horse worth more than my entire ranch riding a trail that kills grown men. You're not seriously considering it. What choice do I have, Caleb? Her voice cracked finally, after weeks of holding it together. 60 days and $700 I don't have, and cattle I can't sell for enough, and a fence he'll probably cut again the second my back is turned. What choice is there except to fight back the only way he's left open to me? Caleb looked toward the pen where Ash stood in the fading light, favoring his leg, less than he had a month ago, standing taller, stronger than the broken animal she'd bought for $40. That trail would kill most horses outright, he said slowly. Shale Pass alone has claimed riders twice his size on animals bred for exactly that kind of terrain. So it's impossible. I didn't say impossible. Caleb turned to look at her, and there was something fierce in his expression now, something that hadn't been there before. I said it would kill most horses. Ash ain't most horses. You said it yourself, something in him survived long before you ever found him. Question is whether we've got enough time to bring that survival all the way to the surface. 60 days. 60 days, Caleb agreed. Starting tomorrow at first light, harder than anything we've done yet. Abigail looked at him, this stranger, who'd become something more in the space of a few short weeks, this man carrying his own old wounds, who'd chosen to plant himself in the middle of her fight, instead of riding on toward whatever else waited for him in the Bitterroots. Why are you still here, Caleb? Really? You could have ridden on weeks ago. He was quiet for a moment, jaw working like he was chewing on words he wasn't sure he should say. Guess I found something worth staying for, he said finally. And then before she could ask him what exactly he meant by that, he turned and walked toward the barn, leaving the question hanging unanswered in the cooling evening air. That night, Abigail lay awake, staring at the ceiling, 60 days echoing in her skull, like a church bell that wouldn't stop ringing. She thought of her father, of the ranch he'd built from nothing, of every insult Victor Harlan had ever thrown her way, and somewhere in the small hours of the morning, fear turned into something else entirely. Resolve. She was going to enter that race. She was going to ride Ash down every mile of Shale Pass and Widow's Ridge if it killed her, and if Victor Harlan wanted a public humiliation, she was going to make certain it wasn't hers to bear. The training that followed made everything before it look gentle by comparison. Caleb pushed both of them harder than Abigail had thought possible, up rocky inclines behind the ranch that mimicked the terrain of the racecourse, through creek crossings that tested Ash's footing across long stretches designed to build the kind of endurance that separated survival from collapse. Again. Caleb called for the 10th time that morning as Abigail brought Ash back around to the base of the incline, both of them soaked with sweat, sides heaving. You're leaning forward too much on the climb. Sit back. Let him find his own rhythm. He's exhausted, Caleb. He's got more in him, trust me. She trusted him. She had learned to these past weeks in a way she hadn't trusted anybody since her father died. She turned Ash back toward the hill, and up they went again and again, until the sun sank low, and her arms ached too much to hold the reins steady. Word of the training spread through the county fast the way word of anything scandalous always did. People started riding out just to watch, lining the ridge above the ranch like it was a Sunday picnic, murmuring and pointing and laughing at the sight of a woman and a half-lame horse, attempting something that seemed doomed from the start. "Look at her," she heard one man say, not quietly enough, as she brought Ash down from another climb. "Really thinks that beast can outrun thunder. Shame, really," a woman added, "watching her humiliate herself like this." Abigail kept her chin up, kept her eyes forward, and didn't let a single word land where it could hurt her. She'd learned that lesson from her father a long time ago, and she was learning it fresh now every single day, with Caleb riding steady beside her, and Ash growing stronger beneath her with every passing mile. But not every visitor came to laugh. It was late in the 4th week when a young girl showed up at the fence line, no older than 10, clutching a small burlap sack like it held something precious. "Miss Hart," she called out, timid, glancing over her shoulder like she was afraid of being seen. Abigail walked over, wiping sweat from her brow. "Can I help you? My name's Sarah Dawson. My pa's got the feed store in town." The girl held out the sack. "I brought this for your horse. It's not much. Just some oats we had extra. But my pa said—" She hesitated, glancing around again. "What did your pa say?" "He said your daddy helped him once years back when the feed store nearly went under. Said your daddy never asked for nothing in return, just helped because it was right." Sarah pushed the sack into Abigail's hands. "So I wanted to help too, even if everybody else is laughing." Abigail felt her throat tighten. "Thank you, Sarah. This means more than you know." "I hope you win," Sarah said, suddenly, fierce chin lifted in a way that reminded Abigail fiercely of herself not so long ago. "I hope you beat Mr. Harlan's old horse, and everybody who's been so mean to you has to eat every word." She ran off before Abigail could respond, small boots kicking up dust, and Abigail stood there holding the sack of oats, like it was the finest gift she'd ever received. "Not everybody's against you," Caleb said, coming up beside her, having watched the whole exchange from the barn. "No," Abigail agreed, wiping her eyes quickly before he could see. "I suppose not." That small kindness carried her through the harder days that followed the day Ash stumbled on the rocky incline, and nearly threw her the day her hands blistered so badly she could barely hold the reins the day Victor rode by, just to remind her, smiling, that 41 days remained, and thunder had already run the full course twice without breaking stride. "You look tired, Miss Hart," he called from the road, not even bothering to stop his horse. "Race is in 41 days. Wouldn't want you to wear yourself out before you even get to lose." "Save your breath, Mr. Harlan," Abigail called back, not looking up from Ash's saddle strap. "You'll need it for all that gloating you're planning to do." Victor laughed and rode on, and Abigail turned back to her work, jaw set, refusing to let him see how deep his words had cut. It was around this time that the first real turning point came, the moment that changed everything about how Abigail understood the horse she'd bought for $40. They'd taken Ash up to the actual base of Shale Pass for the first time, wanting to test him against real terrain instead of the practice hills behind the ranch. The trail wound up through jagged rock formations, narrow enough in places that a wrong step meant a fall of 30 feet or more onto broken stone below. Abigail's stomach was in knots the entire climb, certain any moment Ash's bad leg would give out beneath them both. But he moved with a careful precision she hadn't expected, testing each foothold before committing his weight, finding paths through the rock that even Caleb's more experienced gelding struggled with. "He's done this before," Caleb said, watching from below, something like wonder creeping into his voice. "Or something like it. Look at how he reads the ground." "What do you mean? Most horses, you gotta guide them through terrain like this, foot by foot. He's doing it himself. That ain't training, Abigail. That's instinct built over years, maybe a whole lifetime of surviving country just like this." It hit her, then, standing halfway up Shale Pass with the wind whipping around them and the valley falling away below, this horse dismissed as worthless, mocked as a dying cull, worth less than $40, might carry something inside him, that no amount of money could buy. Something bred into his very bones. "Where did you come from?" she whispered, patting Ash's neck as he paused to catch his breath at a narrow ledge. "What kind of life made you like this?" Ash simply flicked his ears back toward her voice and pressed forward, undaunted by the height, the narrow trail, the wind trying to push them both off balance. They didn't finish the full pass that day. Caleb insisted on turning back before dark, unwilling to risk the descent in failing light. But they'd gone further than either of them had dared hope. And that night, back at the ranch, Abigail felt something bloom in her chest that she hadn't dared name before. Hope. Real hope, not the desperate kind born of having nothing else. "We might actually have a chance," she said, sitting across from Caleb at the kitchen table, both of them exhausted, filthy alive, with the particular energy that came from surviving something dangerous together. "We might," Caleb agreed, and there was something in the way he looked at her, then steady, warm something that had nothing to do with horses or races or debts, that made her breath catch in her throat. "Caleb, I know," he said quietly before she could finish whatever she'd been about to say. "I feel it too, but there's a race to win first and a ranch to save, and I don't want to complicate things you don't have room to carry right now." She nodded understanding, though something in her chest ached at the honesty of it. There would be time for whatever this was between them later, once the more urgent fire had been put out. For now there was training, and there was Victor Harlan circling closer every single day, like a wolf sensing weakness in the herd. The weeks that followed brought their share of small victories and sharper setbacks. Ash's leg grew stronger, his coat filled out his ribs, disappeared beneath new muscle, built from weeks of careful punishing work. But Victor didn't sit idle either. He sent men to watch the training from a distance, reporting back on Ash's progress. He spread word through town that the whole endeavor was a doomed embarrassment, that Abigail Hart was throwing away her last dignity on a fool's errand. He even tried once to buy Caleb off outright, offering him a sum of money that would have set him up comfortably for years if he'd simply ride away and leave Abigail to fail on her own. Caleb told her about it himself that same evening, unprompted. "He offered me $200 to leave," he said, watching her face carefully. "Told me there was no shame in taking money from a man smart enough to know how this ends." Abigail's stomach dropped. And I told him I wasn't for sale," Caleb said simply. "Same as I told him 15 years ago, when he tried the same trick on my father, before he'd figured out the easier route was just to buy up every debt in the county instead." Abigail's breath caught. "Wait, Victor Harlan is the man who took your father's land." Caleb's jaw tightened, a decade of buried anger surfacing all at once. "The very same. Different county, different name for the ranch, but the same man, the same tricks, the same slow strangulation of everything my family built." He looked at her, something fierce and resolved in his eyes. "I didn't come here by accident, Abigail. I heard his name mentioned at a trading post 2 counties over. Heard he was circling a ranch owned by a young woman who'd just lost her father, and something in me needed to see if I could stop the same thing happening twice." The revelation sat heavy in the air between them, reshaping everything Abigail thought she understood about how this stranger had wandered into her life at exactly the right moment. "You should have told me sooner." "I should have," Caleb admitted. "I was afraid you'd think I had some ulterior motive. Some plan of my own using you to settle an old score." "Do you?" "No," he said without hesitation. "Not anymore. Maybe that's how it started somewhere in the back of my mind. But it isn't why I'm still here now." Abigail studied him a long moment, searching for any trace of a lie, and found none. "Then why are you still here?" Caleb's answer was quiet, honest, carrying weight that went beyond the words themselves. "Because somewhere in the middle of all this, it stopped being about Victor Harlan or old grudges or unfinished business. It became about you, about watching you refuse to break day after day no matter what he threw at you. I've never seen anybody fight that hard for something, Abigail. Not once in all my years." The words hung between them, tender and dangerous, and Abigail felt something crack open in her chest that had been sealed tight since the day her father died. But there wasn't time to dwell in that feeling, however much she wanted to. 32 days remained until the race, and word came the following morning that Victor had made an announcement in town that changed the stakes entirely. He'd invited the whole county to attend, offering free food and drink to anyone who came to watch. He'd hired men from 3 towns over to build stands along the finish line. And he'd made certain through careful whispers and pointed comments that everyone understood exactly what was at risk. Not just Abigail's ranch, but her reputation, her father's legacy. Everything the Hart name had ever meant in this county, all riding on the outcome of a single brutal race. "He's turning it into a spectacle," Abigail said, reading the notice a neighbor had brought by hands trembling with fury. "He wants everybody watching when I fail." "Then we make sure you don't fail," Caleb said simply. But even as he said it, doubt crept into his eyes. Doubt he tried to hide, but couldn't quite manage. Shale Pass alone had claimed lives. Widow's Ridge was narrower still, more treacherous, more punishing. And Thunder Victor's champion stallion had never lost a race in his life, bred and trained from birth for exactly this kind of brutal endurance test. That night, as Abigail lay awake once more, staring at the ceiling, with 32 days pressing down on her chest, she heard a sound outside that made her blood run cold. Hoofbeats moving fast, moving away from the direction of the barn. She was up and out the door before she'd even finished pulling on her boots, lantern swinging wildly in her hand, and what she found when she reached the pen stopped her heart cold in her chest. The gate stood open. Ash was gone. The gate hung open on one hinge, swinging slow in the night wind, and for one terrible heartbeat, Abigail's mind refused to accept what her eyes were telling her. "Ash!" She screamed into the darkness, voice cracking. "Ash!" Caleb came running from the bunkhouse he'd taken to sleeping in shirt, half-buttoned, rifle already in hand. "What happened?" "He's gone. The gate, someone opened the gate. Someone. Or someone let him out on purpose." Caleb crouched by the latch, running his fingers over the metal in the lantern light. This wasn't worked loose by an animal leaning on it. Somebody lifted this latch clean by hand. Abigail's stomach dropped through the floor of the earth. "Victor. Maybe? Or maybe somebody wanting us to think it was Victor." Caleb straightened, jaw tight. "Either way, we've got no time to figure out who. We need to find that horse before he breaks a leg out there in the dark or worse." They rode out within minutes. Caleb on his gelding, Abigail bareback on the old mare she kept for chores. Lanterns swinging wild shadows across the ground as they called Ash's name into the black night. Every minute that passed felt like an hour. Every silence that answered their calls felt like a verdict already rendered. "He wouldn't just run," Abigail said, more to herself than to Caleb, desperation cracking her voice. "He trusts me now. Why would he run?" "Horses spook," Caleb said, though even he didn't sound convinced. Something scared him, or someone scared him on purpose. They searched for 2 hours, following broken brush and faint hoof prints in the moonlight. Abigail's heart hammering so hard, she thought it might give out entirely. She thought of 32 days becoming 31, of the race looming closer, of Victor's smug face at the auction, calling her a fool for spending $40 on a dying animal. And now here she was. That same animal vanished into the night, and everything she'd built these past weeks threatening to collapse into nothing. "There," Caleb said, suddenly reining his gelding to a hard stop. "Listen." Abigail strained her ears and heard a low, distressed whinny coming from somewhere down near the dry creek bed that cut along the eastern edge of her property. They found him wedged between 2 boulders. One leg, the bad leg, the leg they'd spent weeks strengthening, caught at an angle that made Abigail's blood run cold. He was thrashing, weakly exhausted from what must have been hours of struggle, his eyes rolling white with panic. "Easy?" Abigail breathed, sliding off the mare before she'd even fully stopped scrambling down the bank toward him. "Easy, Ash. I'm here. I'm here." "Don't rush him," Caleb warned right behind her. "Spooked horse in a trap like that can break your skull with one kick if you crowd him." Abigail forced herself to slow down, forced her breathing steady, even as tears streamed hot down her face. "Ash," she said, softer now, the way she'd learned, the way that had worked from the very first day. Ash, look at me. It's me. It's just me. It's... The horse's ears, pinned flat with terror, twitched toward the sound of her voice. His thrashing slowed just slightly, chest heaving. "That's it," she murmured, inching closer, hand outstretched. "That's it. I'm right here. I'm not leaving you." It took the better part of an hour, working together in the moonlight, to free the trapped leg from between the rocks. Caleb bracing the boulder with a fence post as a lever, while Abigail talked Ash through every terrifying, painful second, her voice never wavering, even as her own heart threatened to shatter. When the leg finally came free, Ash scrambled up onto 3 legs, favoring the 4th so badly he could barely put weight on it at all. "No," Abigail whispered, running her hands down the injured limb with shaking fingers. "No, no, please, not now, not after everything." "Let me look," Caleb said, voice tight with his own fear, crouching to examine the leg by lantern light. Long minutes passed, minutes that felt like years before he finally straightened, exhaling hard. "It's not broken," he said. "Strained bad, maybe torn something deep in the tendon, but it's not broken." Relief crashed through Abigail so hard her knees nearly buckled. "Will he be able to race?" Caleb didn't answer right away, and that silence terrified her more than any words could have. "Caleb?" "I don't know," he admitted finally. "Truth is, I don't know, Abigail. We'll need to rest him, wrap the leg, watch it close over the next few days. But 31 days isn't a lot of time for a tendon injury to heal enough to run Shale Pass." They walked Ash home, slow, agonizingly slow, Abigail on foot beside him the whole way, murmuring encouragement with every painful hitching step. By the time they reached the barn, dawn was breaking pink and gold over the ridgeline, and Abigail had never in her life felt so exhausted or so afraid. They wrapped the leg with strips of clean cloth, soaked in a poultice Caleb mixed from herbs he'd learned from an old Mustang wrangler years back, and they settled Ash into a bed of fresh straw, and then Abigail sat down hard on an overturned bucket, and finally let herself cry. Really cry for the first time since her father's funeral. Great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. Caleb sat beside her without a word, letting her fall apart. And when the worst of it had passed, he finally spoke. "We're not done," he said quietly. "Whatever happens with that leg, we are not done fighting. You hear me?" Abigail wiped her face with the back of her hand, drawing in a shuddering breath. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've watched you these past 2 months," Caleb said. "I've watched you get knocked down by that man again and again, the auction, the fence, the note, and now this, and every single time you get back up. That's not something Victor Harlan can buy or break. That's just who you are." She looked at him. Then this man who'd walked into her life uninvited, and become somehow the steadiest thing in it, and something passed between them that neither one had the strength or the timing to name just yet. "Get some sleep," Caleb said, finally standing and offering her a hand up. "I'll sit with him a while." She didn't sleep, not really. Just lay in her narrow bed staring at the ceiling, mind churning through every possibility, every worst case, until exhaustion finally dragged her under, sometime past noon. She woke to the sound of raised voices in the yard, and her heart lurched into her throat as she scrambled up, certain Victor had come to gloat over the newest disaster. But when she reached the window, it wasn't Victor's carriage in the drive. It was Sarah Dawson's father, the feed store owner, standing beside his wagon with an expression somewhere between anger and urgency. "Miss Hart," he called out when he saw her coming out onto the porch. "There's something you need to hear, and I don't reckon you're gonna like it." Abigail's stomach clenched. "What is it, Mr. Dawson?" "My hired handboy named Tommy works nights sometimes hauling feed for extra coin. Says he saw somebody out near your property last night real late. Says he recognized the horse." Dawson's jaw tightened. "Says it was one of Victor Harlan's men." Caleb, who'd come around from the barn at the sound of the wagon, went very still. "Your hand willing to say that to anybody who asks. Says he'll say it to the sheriff if it comes to that. Boy's got no love for Harlan neither. Man ran his own cousin off a piece of land 2 years back, similar circumstances." Dawson shook his head. "Wanted you to know Miss Hart. Figured you deserved the truth, whatever good it does you. After Dawson left, Abigail sat down hard on the porch step, the confirmation somehow worse than the uncertainty had been. "He tried to kill Ash," she said, voice hollow with disbelief. "Not just scare him off. He opened that gate, hoping Ash would break his neck out there in the dark. Or hoping he'd just run far enough that you'd lose too much time searching to keep training," Caleb said grimly. "Either way, it's proof. Real proof this time, not just suspicion. Proof doesn't matter if the sheriff answers to Victor same as everybody else in this county." "Maybe not," Caleb agreed. "But it matters to you. It matters to me. And it means something else too. It means he's scared." Abigail looked up at him, startled. "Scared? He's got a fortune. He's got the whole county in his pocket. Why would he be scared of me?" Because a man that confident doesn't need to sabotage a fence or bribe a bank to change the terms of a note or sneak onto somebody's property in the dead of night to open a gate. Caleb's eyes were steady, certain. A man that confident just waits for the other side to fail on their own. Victor's doing all this because somewhere in that cold heart of his, he's starting to believe you might actually win. The words settled something in Abigail's chest, a small, hard kernel of determination that no amount of exhaustion or fear could dislodge. "Then we don't let him scare us into stopping." Ash's leg healed slower than either of them hoped, faster than either of them feared. 10 days of careful rest of poultices and gentle walking of Abigail, sitting beside him in the straw each night, reading aloud from her father's old books, just to hear the sound of a voice that wasn't full of mockery or threat, until finally, on the 11th day, Caleb pronounced him fit to begin light work again. "Slow," he warned as Abigail led Ash out into the pen for the first real exercise in nearly 2 weeks. "We push him too hard, too fast. We undo everything that legs fixed itself. How much time do we have left? 21 days. 21 days to rebuild what 10 days of forced rest had cost them. 21 days to prepare a horse with a still healing tendon for the most brutal endurance course in the territory. 21 days standing between Abigail Hart and either the salvation or the final destruction of everything her father had built. They worked harder than ever, but smarter too. Shorter sessions, more frequent rest, careful attention to every flicker of strain in that leg. Caleb taught her to wrap it fresh each morning, to watch for heat or swelling, to know the difference between the normal fatigue of hard work and the first warning signs of real damage. And slowly, impossibly, Ash began to thrive again. The leg held. The muscle came back faster than either of them expected, as though the horse himself understood the stakes and refused to let his body fail, the woman who'd refused to let him die in an auction pen. It was during this stretch that Elliot Reyes showed up again, this time, without any official papers, hat in his hands, glancing over his shoulder the same nervous way he had the first time. "Miss Hart," he said quietly, "I probably shouldn't be here. If Mr. Harlan finds out I came, I could lose my position at the bank." "Then why did you come, Elliot?" He hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I found something, going through the old records back before Mr. Harlan bought up your note. There's an older survey of your property, filed nearly 20 years back before your father even took ownership." "What kind of survey?" "Mineral rights survey," Elliot said. "Seems there was some interest in your land long before your father bought it on account of a vein of silver ore running through the northern section. Nothing ever came of it. The assay came back too thin to be worth mining. At the time, prices weren't high enough. But what? But silver prices have gone up considerable these past few years," Elliot said. "I don't know if it means anything. I don't know if it's even still accurate. But I thought you ought to know it existed, in case it matters somehow." After he left, Abigail stared at the old survey document for a long time, mind racing. "Do you think that's why Victor wants this land so badly?" she asked Caleb. "Not just to add to his holdings, because he knows about this. Man like Victor Harlan doesn't do anything without a reason that ends up making him richer," Caleb said, examining the survey himself. "This might be exactly why he's been so determined to take your land specifically, instead of just any struggling ranch in the county." The revelation added a fire to Abigail's determination that hadn't existed before. This wasn't just about her father's legacy anymore, or her own stubborn pride refusing to be crushed. Victor Harlan had been trying to steal something far more valuable than he'd ever let on, hiding behind talk of foreclosure and market values, while quietly scheming to seize a fortune buried beneath her own land. "We can't prove any of this matters," Caleb cautioned. "Old Survey Thin Vein might not amount to anything even if we could stop him." "Doesn't matter," Abigail said, jaw set. "Whether there's silver under that ground or not, this is still my father's land, still my home. And I am not giving Victor Harlan one single inch of it, silver or no silver." The days ticked down with brutal speed after that. 14 days, then 10, then 7, and the whole county seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the spectacle Victor had promised them all. It was 6 days before the race that the sheriff himself rode out to the Hart Ranch, and Abigail's stomach twisted with dread the moment she saw his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. "Miss Hart," Sheriff Coburn said, tipping his hat, though his expression was carefully neutral in a way that told her nothing good. "Got a complaint filed against you. Serious one." "A complaint from who?" "Victor Harlan. Says you've been harassing him, making threats, spreading lies about his character around town." Coburn's eyes flicked toward Caleb standing nearby with Ash's lead rope in hand. "And there's a complaint against your hired man, too. Says he's got no legal right to be on this property. No proof of employment. Nothing to say he ain't some drifter with a history of trouble." "That's absurd," Abigail said, fury rising fast. "I haven't threatened Victor Harlan. If anything, he's the one who's been—" "I'm not here to litigate the truth of it, Miss Hart," Coburn cut in. Not unkindly, but firm. "I'm here because a complaint was filed, and I've got to look into it. That means I need to see some papers on your hired man here. Proof he's legitimately employed, not just some vagrant you've taken in." Caleb's jaw tightened, and Abigail saw something flash across his face. Not fear exactly, but the wary stillness of a man who'd learned the hard way what happened when the law got tangled up with a rich man's grudges. "I don't have papers, Sheriff," Caleb said evenly. "Never signed anything formal. Just came to help, and Miss Hart agreed to let me stay." "That's a problem," Coburn said. "Without documentation, I've got no choice but to ask you to leave the property until this complaint's been sorted proper. Could take weeks, maybe longer depending on the circuit judge's schedule." Abigail's heart dropped straight through the floor. "The race is in 6 days, Sheriff. If Caleb has to leave now—" "I'm sorry, Miss Hart. My hands are tied on this." "Your hands are tied because Victor Harlan pays your salary same as he pays half this county's," Abigail snapped, unable to contain herself any longer. Coburn's expression hardened. "That's a serious accusation." "It's a serious situation," Abigail shot back. "He's trying to strip away everything and everyone helping me before the race even starts, and you're standing here helping him do it." For a long, tense moment, nobody spoke. Then Caleb stepped forward calm, despite the storm raging in Abigail's chest. "I'll go, Sheriff," he said quietly. "Don't want to cause Miss Hart any more trouble than she's already carrying." "Caleb, no. It's all right," he said, turning to her, something steady and certain in his eyes despite the circumstances. "You know everything I know now. You know how to read him, how to wrap that leg, how to pace him on the climbs. You don't need me standing right beside you to finish what we started." "I do need you," Abigail said, voice breaking. "Caleb, the race is in 6 days." "And you'll ride it," Caleb said firmly. "With everything I've taught you, and everything you've already proven you're capable of on your own." He turned back to Coburn. "I'll clear out today, Sheriff. No trouble. But I'll be watching that race from wherever I end up standing, same as everybody else in this county." Coburn nodded, some flicker of discomfort crossing his weathered face. Like even he understood the injustice being carried out here, even if his position wouldn't allow him to say so outright. "I'm sorry, Miss Hart. Truly." After he rode off, Abigail turned to Caleb, tears burning hot behind her eyes. "This is my fault. I should have never let you get tangled up in all this." "Don't you dare say that." Caleb's voice was fierce, gripping her shoulders gently but firmly. "This was never a burden, Abigail. Not one single day of it. And it's not over yet, not by a long shot. Victor thinks pulling me away breaks something in you. He's wrong. How can you be so sure? Because I've watched you become someone even you don't fully see yet, Caleb said, voice softening. The woman who bought a dying horse for $40, because everybody else in that crowd had already given up on him, that woman doesn't need me standing beside her to finish this fight. She just needed somebody to remind her what she already had inside. He left that afternoon, Abigail watching from the porch as his gelding carried him down the long dirt road away from the ranch, and something in her chest ached fiercer than she'd expected. A loss, layered on top of every other loss these past months, had already carved into her. But she didn't have time to dwell in grief. 6 days remained, and whatever Victor thought he'd accomplished by driving Caleb away, he'd only succeeded in lighting a fire in Abigail that burned hotter than ever before. She trained alone those final days, waking before dawn, working Ash through every exercise Caleb had taught her, talking to the horse the way she had from that very first morning in the auction pen, telling him everything, her fears, her fury, her father's memory, the silver that might or might not run beneath their feet, the man who'd tried to destroy them both and failed at every turn. 2 days before the race, Sarah Dawson showed up again, this time with her father trailing behind her, both of them carrying baskets loaded with feed and supplies. "We heard what happened," Mr. Dawson said gruffly, unloading the baskets without waiting for permission. "Figured you could use some help, seeing as your hired man got run off on account of a rich man's lies." "Mr. Dawson, I can't ask you to risk—" "Ain't asking permission, Miss Hart. Just helping a neighbor, same as your daddy helped me once." He set down the last basket and straightened, meeting her eyes with quiet resolve. "There's more of us on your side than you might think. Just most folks are too scared of Harlan to say it out loud." That night, unable to sleep, Abigail walked out to the pen and found Ash standing at the fence line, watching her approach with an ease that had nothing left of the wary, wounded creature she'd bought all those months ago. "Tomorrow's the last day before it all comes down to this," she told him softly, running a hand down his neck. "I don't know if we're ready. I don't know if any amount of training could ever really prepare us for what's waiting on that trail." Ash pressed his head against her shoulder, warm and solid, and impossibly achingly alive. "But I know this," she whispered, voice thick with everything she'd carried these past months. Her father's death, the auction's humiliation, Victor's endless cruelty, Caleb's absence, aching like a fresh wound. "I know that everybody who ever looked at you and saw nothing worth saving was wrong. And tomorrow, the whole county's going to see just how wrong they were." The morning of the race dawned clear and merciless, the kind of bright, cloudless sky that seemed almost cruel in its indifference to what was about to unfold. Abigail woke before the sun, her stomach twisted into knots so tight she could barely force down the small breakfast she knew she'd need for the hours ahead. She found a crowd already gathering at the starting line when she arrived, far larger than she'd expected. Nearly the whole county, it seemed, drawn by Victor's promise of free food and the irresistible pull of watching a spectacle unfold. Stands had been built, just as promised, filled with spectators, eager for what most of them expected to be a brief, humiliating defeat. Victor sat astride Thunder near the front, the black stallion gleaming with muscle and confidence. Every inch the champion he'd been bred and trained to be. Victor himself wore an expression of pure satisfaction, a man certain the outcome was already decided. "Miss Hart," he called out as she approached, voice carrying easy over the murmur of the crowd. "Glad you decided to show up even without your hired hand standing beside you. Wouldn't want folks to think you'd lost your nerve." "I don't lose my nerve, Mr. Harlan," Abigail called back, steadying her voice despite the roar of her own pulse in her ears. "Just my patience for men who cheat rather than compete fair." A ripple ran through the crowd at that murmurs and glances exchanged, and Victor's smile flickered just slightly before he recovered it. "Bold words," he said, "for a woman about to watch her broken-down horse collapse somewhere around mile 3. We'll see, Mr. Harlan." She turned away before he could respond further, leading Ash toward the starting line, and it was there at the edge of the crowd that she spotted a familiar figure standing near the fence, hat pulled low but unmistakable all the same. Caleb. Their eyes met across the distance, and he gave her a small, fierce nod, one that carried everything he couldn't say aloud, with Coburn's men likely watching for any excuse to remove him entirely. Abigail felt something steady in her chest at the sight of him, some final piece of resolve, locking firmly into place. "Riders," the starter called out, voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "Take your positions." Abigail swung up into the saddle, ash shifting beneath her ears, pricked forward, muscles coiled with an energy that felt different than anything she'd felt in him before. Not nervous energy, not fear, but something closer to anticipation. Something that looked, if she let herself believe it, almost like readiness. Around them, a dozen other riders took their positions. Men on fine horses bred for speed. Men who'd trained for months on courses far less brutal than the one waiting ahead. And there at the front sat Victor Harlan on Thunder, radiating the absolute certainty of a man who'd already spent the prize money in his head 100 times over. "On my mark," the starter called, raising a pistol into the air. Abigail leaned forward, whispering one final thing into Ash's ear. Words meant only for him, words that carried every ounce of faith she had left in this world. "Whatever happens today," she murmured, "you already proved everybody wrong just by surviving long enough to stand here. Now let's show them the rest." The pistol cracked, and the race began. The other rider shot ahead immediately, hooves thundering dust rising in great clouds behind them, and Abigail felt her heart lurch as horse after horse pulled away from her at the start. Ash held back steady, unbothered by the chaos around him, and for one terrible second, Abigail feared Caleb's training had failed them both. "Come on," she urged, leaning forward. "Come on, Ash. Don't push him yet." The voice cut through the roar of hooves, and Abigail's head snapped toward the sound. Caleb was running alongside the fence line, keeping pace as long as he could, shouting over the noise. "Let them burn out first. Ride your own race, not theirs." She didn't have time to answer, didn't have time to wonder how he'd known she needed to hear exactly that at exactly that moment. She simply trusted it the way she'd learned to trust everything else he'd taught her these past months, and she settled back into the saddle, letting Ash find his own rhythm, instead of fighting to keep pace with animals bred for speed over distance. Thunder led the pack easily, Victor's black stallion eating up the ground with long, powerful strides, and Abigail watched him pull further and further ahead, with a sick feeling twisting in her stomach. "He's not going to slow down," she muttered to herself. "Caleb, he's not slowing down." But then, barely a mile in, she saw the first crack in the pack. A rider on a chestnut mare pulled up hard, the horse stumbling, already blowing too hard from a pace it couldn't sustain. Another rider veered off entirely, his horse rearing in protest against terrain it hadn't been conditioned for. "Ride your own race," Abigail whispered to herself, echoing Caleb's words like a prayer. "Ride your own race." The trail began to climb, and here finally Ash's training showed its worth. Where other horses hesitated at the rocky incline, breaking stride. Uncertain of their footing, Ash moved with the same careful precision he'd shown on their practice runs up Shale Pass, reading each foothold before committing his weight, never wasting a single motion. They passed their first rider on that incline, a young man on a nervous roan who'd pushed his horse too hard, too early, and was now paying the price, the animal trembling and refusing to climb further. "Easy," Abigail called out as she passed him, some instinct making her want to help even in the middle of competition. "Give him a minute, don't force it." "Save your breath, Miss Hart," the young man snapped back, though there was no real venom in it, just frustration and fear. "Just win the damn thing so this is worth something." She pressed on, climbing higher, the crowd's noise fading behind her into the vast quiet of the mountain trail. Ahead, she could just make out the shapes of the leading riders, Victor's black stallion still far out front, but the gap seemed impossibly slightly smaller than it had been moments before. The trail narrowed as it wound toward the first true test, a rocky shelf overlooking a steep drop barely wide enough for a single horse to pass. Abigail's stomach clenched as she approached it, remembering Elliot's warning about riders who died on ground far less treacherous than this. Ash slowed of his own accord, testing the footing with the same careful precision he'd shown on their training runs, and Abigail forced herself to trust him completely. Hands loose on the reins, weight balanced back the way Caleb had taught her. "That's it," she murmured. "That's it, easy. Now easy." A horse screamed somewhere ahead, a sound of pure animal terror that froze Abigail's blood in her veins. She rounded the bend to find one of the lead riders, a burly man on a powerful sorrel fighting to control his mount, at the narrowest point of the shelf, the horse's back legs slipping on loose shale hooves, scrambling for purchase over the edge. "Help!" the man shouted, panic raw in his voice. "Somebody, please!" Abigail's heart screamed at her to keep riding, to protect the fragile lead she'd built, to remember that this man had laughed at her in that auction pen months ago, along with everyone else. But something deeper than competition took hold of her instead. "Ash, steady," she commanded, sliding off before she'd even fully decided to, scrambling toward the terrified horse and rider. "Miss Hart, what are you—" The man started, disbelief cutting through his panic. "Shut up and grab the bridle when I say," Abigail snapped, moving to the horse's head, murmuring low and steady, the same way she'd talked Ash through that terrible night trapped between the boulders. "Easy, easy. I've got you." Working together, they managed to guide the panicked sorrel back from the edge, its hooves finding solid ground at last, the man practically collapsing with relief once he was clear of the drop. "Why did you stop?" he asked, staring at her like she'd grown a second head. "You could have just ridden past. Left me to sort it myself." "Because nobody deserves to die over a horse race," Abigail said simply, swinging back up into her own saddle. "Even you, Frank Dalton, even after everything you said about me at that auction." She left him there stunned and pressed forward, and it was only a mile further that she realized her small act of mercy had cost her more time than she'd expected. The gap to the leaders had widened again. "Doesn't matter," she told herself, urging Ash forward. "Doesn't matter, we ride our own race." The trail grew steeper, more treacherous, winding now through Widow's Ridge, the section Elliot had warned her about, specifically narrow enough in places that a single misstep meant a fall of 100 feet or more onto jagged rock below. 2 more riders had already turned back by the time Abigail reached it, their horses refusing to continue, sensing danger their riders couldn't fully articulate. "This is where it gets real," she murmured to Ash, feeling his muscles bunch beneath her, alert and focused in a way that reminded her fiercely of that first day in the auction pen when she'd seen something in his eyes that wasn't quite fear. They crossed the ridge, slow, methodical, Ash placing each hoof with the same careful precision that had carried them up Shale Pass weeks before, and Abigail found herself holding her breath the entire way, wind whipping at her hair, the drop yawning terrible and close on one side. Halfway across, disaster struck. A loose section of shale gave way beneath Ash's back hoof, and for one heart-stopping instant, Abigail felt the horse lurch sideways, scrambling for purchase that wasn't there. She screamed, grabbing for the saddle horn, certain this was the moment everything ended, the moment Victor Harlan's cruelty finally claimed its victory. But Ash didn't fall. He twisted his body with an agility that shouldn't have been possible for a horse with a healing tendon injury, throwing his weight forward, hooves finding solid rock just in time, and they were through past the loose section, onto stable ground once more. Abigail sat there for a moment, shaking, tears streaming unbidden down her face, before she managed to find her voice again. "You saved us," she whispered. "You saved us both." Ash simply pressed forward, undaunted, as though near death was simply another obstacle to be handled with the same quiet determination he brought to everything else. They cleared Widow's Ridge with 2 riders still ahead of them, Victor on Thunder far in the lead, and one other rider Abigail didn't recognize, a wiry man on a lean buckskin gelding pushing hard to close the gap with the leader. The trail descended now into the canyon proper, and here Abigail felt Ash's pace quicken, as though the terrain itself spoke to something ancient and instinctive buried deep in his bloodline. They passed the buckskin gelding within the first mile of the descent, its rider staring in disbelief as the horse he'd dismissed as a joke back at the starting line surged past him with startling ease. "That's not possible," she heard him mutter as she passed. That horse was supposed to be worthless. Worthless is just a word people use for things they haven't bothered to understand. Abigail called back and pressed on. Now it was just her and Victor, the gap between them shrinking with every mile, and Abigail could see him glance back over his shoulder. Disbelief, and the first flickers of real fear crossing his face when he realized the horse he'd mocked as a dying cull was closing in on his champion stallion. Impossible! She heard him shout more to himself than to her. That animal should have collapsed by now. But Ash didn't collapse. If anything, he seemed to draw strength from the challenge, from the sight of Thunder's tail flicking just ahead, closing the distance with a steady, relentless determination that no amount of Victor's money or breeding could match. They entered the canyon floor together, close enough now that Abigail could hear Thunder's labored breathing, could see the lather building on the stallion's flanks, from a pace Victor had pushed too hard, too early, exactly the mistake Caleb had warned her against making herself. "You should have trained him better," Abigail called out, drawing alongside despite herself unable to resist the small victory of the moment. "Speed's worthless if he can't finish." "He'll finish," Victor snarled, spurring Thunder harder, the stallion's ears pinning back in protest at the treatment. "Get back, Miss Hart, or I'll make sure you regret this humiliation." "Is that a threat, Mr. Harlan?" "It's a promise." He spurred his horse again, harder this time, and Abigail watched with growing alarm as Thunder's stride began to falter, the stallion's breathing turning ragged and desperate under the punishment. This was exactly what Caleb had described weeks ago, a horse pushed past its limits by a rider who understood nothing about pacing, about patience, about the difference between speed and true endurance. They rounded a bend in the canyon, and that's when disaster struck for Victor Harlan. Thunder's front leg caught on a hidden root hidden by shadow and speed, and Victor's own reckless pace, and the great stallion went down hard, screaming in pain. Victor thrown clear, but landing badly against the canyon wall. Abigail's instinct screamed at her to keep riding, to seize the lead that had just been handed to her, to finally beat the man who'd tormented her for months. But she was already pulling Ash to a stop, before she'd even fully processed the decision, sliding off, running back toward the wreckage of horse and rider. "Victor," she shouted, dropping to her knees beside him. "Victor, can you hear me?" He groaned, clutching his arm at an angle that told her immediately it was broken. His face contorted with pain, and something else shocked maybe at finding her here at all, choosing to stop. "Why?" he gasped. "Why would you stop? You could win." "Shut up!" Abigail snapped, already assessing the damage, with hands that remembered every lesson her father had ever taught her about doctoring injured animals and injured men alike. "Your arm's broken. Don't move it." Thunder screamed again, thrashing weakly, and Abigail's heart broke at the sound this magnificent animal, punished beyond his limits by a rider who'd never learned the lessons she and Caleb had spent months mastering together. "His leg," she said, moving toward the stallion, despite Victor's weak protest. "Let me see his leg." She ran her hands down the limb, the way Caleb had taught her, feeling for the telltale signs of a true break, versus a strain and relief flooded through her when she found no fracture, just a deep, painful bruise that would heal with proper rest. "He's not broken," she called back to Victor. "Strained bad, but he'll heal if you actually let him rest this time, instead of pushing him past every limit he has." "Why do you care?" Victor asked, voice raw with pain and confusion. "I've done nothing but try to destroy you for months. Why would you stop to help me?" Abigail sat back on her heels, looking at this man who'd tormented her since her father's funeral, who'd cut her fences and manipulated her banknote and driven Caleb away with false accusations, and she found to her own surprise that her answer came without any hesitation at all. "Because that's not who I am, Victor," she said simply. "Whatever you've decided about me, whatever this whole county thinks they know about the Hart name, I'm not the kind of person who leaves an injured man and a suffering animal on the ground just to win a race." Other riders were catching up now, the sound of approaching hooves growing louder, and Abigail knew her window to reclaim the lead was closing fast. But she stayed exactly where she was, tending to Thunder's leg, making sure Victor's arm was properly braced, until the first riders rounded the bend and saw the scene laid out before them. "Go," Victor said suddenly, voice hoarse. "Go, Miss Hart. Finish the race. I'll be fine here, others are coming." Are you sure? Go, he said again, something raw and unreadable crossing his face. You've already proven whatever point you needed to prove. Now finish what you started. Abigail hesitated only a moment longer before swinging back up onto Ash, who'd waited patiently through the entire ordeal, ears pricked forward, as though he understood exactly what had just transpired. Let's finish this, she told him, and they surged forward back into the race. 3 other riders now visible on the trail ahead having passed them during the delay. The final stretch of canyon gave way to open ground, and here Ash truly came alive, muscles working in perfect rhythm beneath her. The ash-gray coat darkened with sweat, but showing no sign of the exhaustion that had claimed half the field already. They passed the first rider within a quarter mile, then the second, the crowd's distant roar growing louder as they approached the final stretch toward town. Only one rider remained ahead of them now, the wiry man on the buckskin gelding, pushing his horse with everything he had left, sensing the finish line drawing near. Come on, Abigail urged, leaning forward, feeling Ash respond with a fresh surge of speed that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere physical strength. Come on, we're almost there. They closed the gap with startling speed, the buckskin's rider glancing back in disbelief as the horse he'd dismissed as worthless drew alongside him, then ahead in the final stretch before the town came into view. The crowd's roar hit her like a physical wave as they emerged from the canyon trail, thousands of eyes turning toward the unlikely sight of Abigail Hart riding alone well ahead of every other competitor crossing toward a finish line nobody in that crowd had believed she'd ever reach. She saw faces in the crowd, shock, disbelief, and here and there unmistakable joy. She saw Sarah Dawson jumping up and down screaming her name. She saw Mr. Dawson and other faces she recognized from months of quiet kindness amid the county's cruelty. And there, near the finish line, unmistakable even at this distance, stood Caleb, hat off, watching her approach with an expression that made her chest ache with something far bigger than the race itself. Ash crossed the finish line first, well ahead of any other rider, and the crowd's roar became something almost deafening, a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Abigail slid off the saddle on legs that could barely hold her weight, and the first person to reach her was Caleb, pulling her into an embrace so fierce it nearly knocked the wind from her lungs entirely. You did it, he breathed against her hair. Abigail, you actually did it. We did it, she corrected, pulling back just enough to look at him, tears and dust and triumph all mixed together on her face. You taught him everything he needed to know. You taught me everything I needed to know. I taught you the skills, Caleb said, voice thick with emotion. But the heart that made you stop for Victor, that made you risk the whole race to help an injured man and horse, that was never something I taught you. That's just who you are. The crowd surged forward, then a chaotic mix of congratulations and disbelief faces that had mocked her just months before now, looking at her with something entirely different, respect maybe, or the particular shame of people forced to confront how wrong they'd been. But even as the celebration swirled around her, Abigail's mind snagged on something that didn't fit. Something that had been nagging at the edge of her thoughts since the moment she'd knelt beside Victor Harlan's broken body in that canyon. Where's the sheriff? She asked, suddenly scanning the crowd. Where's Coburn? Someone needs to go back for Victor and Thunder. Already sent riders, Caleb assured her. They'll bring him back safe. But something in his tone made her look at him more closely. Caleb, what aren't you telling me? He hesitated, glancing around at the crowd still celebrating nearby, then leaned in close enough that only she could hear. While you were out on the trail, something happened here in town. Something that changes everything. What do you mean? Elliot Reyes, Caleb said quietly. He came to find me right after the race started. Said he couldn't stay silent any longer about what he'd found. Abigail's stomach tightened with a fresh wave of apprehension. Found what? Caleb's expression turned grim, and around them, the celebration continued unaware. But Abigail felt the ground shift beneath her feet as surely as it had on that treacherous stretch of Widow's Ridge. The mineral survey wasn't the only thing he found buried in those old records, Caleb said slowly. There's something else, Abigail. Something about your father's original note and how Victor really came to hold it in the first place. Tell me. Not here, Caleb said, glancing again at the crowd pressing closer. Elliot's waiting at the bank office. Says it can't wait until tomorrow. Says the whole truth needs to come out today, while the whole town's already gathered and paying attention. Abigail looked back toward the canyon trail where riders were surely bringing Victor and Thunder back, even now then toward the bank office in the distance, where whatever truth Elliot had uncovered waited to reshape everything she thought she understood about the battle she'd just won. Show me, she said. The bank office was already crowded by the time Abigail arrived, word having spread through town faster than she could ride there herself. Elliot Reyes stood behind the counter, looking paler than she'd ever seen him. A stack of papers spread out before him, like evidence at a trial. Miss Hart, he said, voice unsteady. I'm sorry to pull you away from your celebration, but this couldn't wait. What did you find, Elliot? He glanced nervously at the gathering crowd pressing in through the doorway, drawn by curiosity and the electric sense that something important was unfolding. I found the original transfer documents, the ones from when your father's note first got sold. Victor bought it from the bank. That's not new information. That's what everyone was told, Elliot said. But the bank didn't sell it willingly, Miss Hart. Look at this. He slid a document across the counter, hands trembling. This is a letter from 3 years back. Victor Harlan threatened to pull every account he controlled, and he controlled plenty, being the richest man in the county, unless the bank agreed to sell him your father's note the moment it came up for renewal. Abigail's blood ran cold as she scanned the letter, Victor's own signature unmistakable at the bottom. He was planning this for 3 years. Longer, maybe. But there's more. Elliot pulled out another document, this one older edges worn soft with handling. Your father took out that original loan to cover a bad harvest back when cattle prices crashed. Standard terms, reasonable interest. Nothing unusual. But somebody altered the terms after the fact, raised the interest rate, added penalties that were never part of the original agreement. Altered how? Altered by who? Elliot's throat worked as he swallowed hard. By the previous bank manager, a man named Foster who left town rather suddenly about 2 years ago. Right around the time Victor Harlan made a substantial deposit into a new account under a different name. The room had gone utterly silent, the crowd pressing closer to hear every word, and Abigail felt something hot and furious rising in her chest, even as her mind struggled to process the full weight of what Elliot was describing. He bribed the manager to alter my father's loan terms, she said slowly, making the debt look larger than it actually was. Then he waited until the terms he'd falsified made repayment impossible and bought the note himself when the bank had no choice but to sell. That's what the documents suggest, yes. That's fraud, Abigail said, voice shaking now with a fury that had been building for months, finally finding somewhere solid to land. That's not aggressive business. That's theft, plain and simple. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Abigail turned to find dozens of faces watching her, watching this moment unfold, some with shock, others with a dawning uncomfortable recognition. He's done it before, someone called out from the back of the crowd. Abigail turned to see an older man she vaguely recognized, weathered and gray, stepping forward with obvious reluctance. Name's Walter Pruitt. My brother lost his ranch to Harlan 4 years back, similar circumstances. Always figured it was just bad luck, bad timing. His jaw tightened. Never thought to question the paperwork. Another voice joined in, a woman this time. My husband's cousin lost his land too. Different county, but same story. Debt that never seemed to add up, right sold off to Harlan just when it mattered most. Abigail felt the room shifting around her, felt the weight of months of quiet suffering, finally finding its voice, one testimony after another, emerging from a crowd that had spent years too afraid or too uncertain to speak the truth aloud. It was at that moment that the door burst open and Sheriff Coburn entered, supporting Victor Harlan, whose arm hung in a makeshift sling, his face pale with pain. And something else. The dawning realization that whatever he'd expected to find upon returning to town, this scene of exposed fraud and gathering testimony was not it. What in God's name is happening here? Victor demanded, though his voice lacked its usual commanding certainty. "The truth, Mr. Harlan," Abigail said, turning to face him, fully holding up the documents Elliot had found. "The truth about how you really came to hold my father's note, about Foster, and the altered terms, and the bribe that made all of it possible." Victor's face went through a rapid series of expressions. Shock, calculation, and finally something that looked almost like resignation. "You have no proof of any wrongdoing. I have Foster's signature on the altered terms," Elliot said, finding his courage now that others had spoken up around him. "I have bank records showing a deposit into an account tied to a false name, the timing matching exactly with when he disappeared. And I have your own letter, Mr. Harlan threatening the bank's stability if they didn't sell you that note the moment it became available. That letter proves nothing but aggressive business tactics," Victor said, though his voice had lost its earlier conviction. "Maybe not on its own," Sheriff Coburn said slowly, and Abigail turned to see something shifting in the lawman's expression. Some calculation of his own playing out behind his eyes. "But combined with testimony from half this county about similar circumstances, that's enough for a formal investigation, Mr. Harlan. More than enough." "You wouldn't dare," Victor said, though the threat carried none of its usual weight. His broken arm and battered dignity stripping away the authority he'd wielded so casually for years. "I've turned a blind eye to plenty over the years," Coburn said, voice heavy with something that might have been shame. "Told myself it wasn't my place to question a man with your kind of money and influence. But watching that woman ride into this town today after everything you tried to do to stop her..." He shook his head. "I reckon I've turned a blind eye long enough." The crowd had grown larger still, spilling out the door into the street beyond, and Abigail felt the weight of every eye upon her, waiting to see what she'd do with this sudden overwhelming shift in power. She thought of her father, of the quiet dignity with which he'd built this ranch from nothing, of the months of humiliation and struggle she'd endured since his death, of Caleb's own family torn apart by this same man's greed years before in a different county. She thought of Sarah Dawson's fierce belief that justice might still be possible, of Mr. Dawson's quiet generosity in the face of Victor's cruelty, of every small kindness that had carried her through the darkest days of this fight. And she thought of Ash, standing patient and strong through every trial thrown at him, never once giving up, despite a world that had already decided he was worthless. "I could ruin you completely," she said finally, meeting Victor's eyes directly. "I could press for every charge Sheriff Coburn just mentioned. I could make sure this whole county knows exactly what kind of man you really are, and watch you lose everything the same way you tried to make me lose everything." Victor's jaw tightened, waiting for the blow he clearly expected was coming. "But I'm not going to do that," Abigail continued, and she watched surprise ripple across his face, across the faces of the crowd around her. "Not because you deserve mercy, Mr. Harlan. You don't. But because I refuse to become the kind of person who finds satisfaction in another person's ruin, even when that person has earned every bit of consequence coming to him." "Then what do you want?" Victor asked, voice hoarse. "Restitution," Abigail said simply. "Every family you've cheated through fraud like this, the Pruitts, the others who lost their land under similar circumstances, they get their fair share back. Every fraudulent note gets reviewed and corrected. And my father's note gets voided entirely, the debt erased, since it was built on lies from the very foundation. That would cost me nearly everything I've built," Victor said, disbelief creeping into his voice. "You built it on stolen ground," Abigail said. "Seems only fair it cost you everything to make it right." The room held its breath, waiting for Victor's response, and Abigail watched something complicated play out across his face. Pride warring with fear, greed warring with the first genuine flicker of shame she'd ever seen him display. "And if I refuse?" he asked finally. "Then Sheriff Coburn conducts his investigation," Abigail said, "and every piece of evidence Elliot's found, along with every testimony from every family you've wronged, goes before a circuit judge. You'll lose it all anyway, Mr. Harlan. The only difference is whether you lose it with some shred of dignity intact by making this right yourself, or whether you lose it in disgrace, dragged through it by force." Victor was silent for a long moment, the crowd watching, waiting, the whole weight of months of quiet suffering hanging in the balance. "Fine," he said finally, voice hollow. "Fine, I'll make it right. The Pruitts, the others. Your father's note. He looked at her, something almost like respect flickering behind the pain and humiliation. Why offer me this instead of destroying me completely when you had every right to? Abigail considered the question carefully before answering. Because out on that trail today, I had a choice too. I could have ridden past you lying there injured and secured my victory without any risk at all. But I stopped because that's not the kind of person I want to be, regardless of what you've done to me. She held his gaze steady. This isn't about being weak, Mr. Harlan. It's about understanding that the way you treat people, especially people who've wronged you, says everything about your own character. I'd rather build something real out of this mess than spend my life poisoned by revenge. The crowd erupted. Then, not in the ugly mocking laughter that had followed Abigail for months, but in something entirely different, murmurs of astonishment, of respect, even scattered applause that grew louder as it spread through the room and out into the street beyond. It took the better part of the following weeks to sort through the full consequences of that day. Victor's lawyers fought every point they could, but with Elliot's documentation, Sheriff Coburn's formal investigation and testimony from half a dozen families who'd suffered similar fraud, there was simply no path forward except the one Abigail had offered. The Pruitts got their land back. 2 other families, similarly wronged over the years, received restitution that finally allowed them to rebuild what Victor's schemes had taken from them. And Abigail's father's note, the debt that had hung over her like an executioner's blade for months, was formally voided, the fraudulent terms exposed and erased entirely. Caleb's own history with Victor Harlan came to light during the proceedings as well, and though the statute of limitations prevented any direct restitution for what had happened to his family years before in a different county, the public exposure of Victor's methods brought Caleb something he hadn't expected to find: a kind of closure, a validation that what had happened to his father hadn't been simple bad luck, but the same calculated cruelty that had nearly destroyed Abigail too. I spent years thinking I should have fought harder, Caleb told her one evening, sitting together on the porch as the sun sank low over land that finally truly belonged to her free and clear. Thinking if I'd just found the right proof, the right argument, things might have turned out different for my father. And now I understand some fights aren't about proof or argument at all, he said, looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Some fights are about finding the right person to stand beside someone who refuses to give up even when everything says they should. You make it sound like I did something remarkable. You bought a dying horse for $40 when the whole county had already written him off, Caleb said. You fought a man with more money and power than anyone else in 3 territories, and you found a way to win without losing yourself in the process. Abigail, that is remarkable. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unsaid between them finally pressing close enough to acknowledge. Caleb, she started. I know, he said softly. I feel it too. I have since that first week watching you talk to a horse everybody else had given up on, refusing to see him as anything less than worth saving. He reached over, taking her hand gently in his. I don't know what comes next, Abigail. I don't know if a drifter with nothing but a gelding and some hard-won knowledge about horses has any business hoping for something more with a woman who just saved her father's entire legacy. Maybe the question isn't what you have to offer, Abigail said quietly. Maybe it's simpler than that. How do you mean? You stayed, she said, when you could have ridden on toward the Bitterroots weeks ago, toward whatever future waited there. You stayed and you fought beside me, and you never once asked for anything in return except the chance to prove yourself right about a horse nobody else believed in. That's not nothing staying, Caleb said. No. Abigail agreed, her fingers tightening around his. It's everything. They sat together as darkness fell, the ranch quiet around them, except for the distant sound of Ash moving in his pen, healthy and strong, no longer the broken creature the auction crowd had dismissed as worthless. 3 weeks after the race, a letter arrived that changed everything once more. This time not through cruelty or manipulation, but through simple, honest opportunity. A mining company from the territorial capital had heard whispers of the old silver survey, and their formal assessment confirmed what Elliot had suspected all along. The vein running beneath the northern section of Abigail's land was substantial, far more valuable now with rising silver prices than it had been when the original survey was conducted decades before. "This could set you up for the rest of your life," Elliot told her, reviewing the mining company's offer with something like awe. "More money than the ranch has seen in a generation." Abigail thought about it carefully before responding, thought about her father's dream for this land, about the quiet dignity of raising cattle and building something lasting rather than simply extracting wealth and moving on. "I'll lease them a portion," she said finally. "Enough to bring in steady income, enough to secure the ranch's future properly. But not the whole thing. This land is more than just what's buried beneath it." The decision proved wise, bringing in enough steady income to rebuild everything Victor's schemes had damaged, to expand the cattle herd, to hire proper hands instead of struggling along on her own exhausted labor. And still, the heart of the ranch remained exactly what her father had built it to be, a place of hard work and honest dealing, not simply a source of extracted wealth. Caleb stayed on, not as hired help anymore, but as something far more permanent. Their courtship unfolded slowly, carefully built on the same foundation of trust and mutual respect that had carried them through months of shared struggle. There was no rush to it, no desperate grasping at happiness after so much hardship, just a steady growing certainty that they'd found in each other something worth building a life around. It was nearly 6 months after the race, on a clear autumn morning with the first hint of winter's chill in the air, that Caleb finally asked her the question that had been growing between them since that very first day. He'd stepped into her yard hat in hand, offering help she hadn't known she needed. "Abigail Hart," he said, standing in the same pen where Ash had once stood, broken and distrustful, now grazing peacefully nearby. "I never expected to find anything worth staying for when I rode onto this land, looking to settle an old score. But I found you instead, and I found a horse that taught me something about second chances I'd forgotten how to believe in. I'd be honored, more honored than I know how to properly say, if you'd let me stay here permanently. As your husband, if you'll have me." Abigail felt tears rise unbidden, thinking of everything that had led them to this moment. The humiliation at the auction. The fence. Victor had destroyed the note he'd manipulated, Caleb's own painful history. Finally finding some measure of peace. And through it all, a horse that everybody else had given up on, standing as living proof that value often hides in places nobody bothers to look. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Caleb Morgan, I'll have you." They married that winter, a small ceremony attended by the friends who'd stood by her through the darkest months. Sarah Dawson, now grown bold and confident, serving as flower girl with fierce pride. Mr. Dawson and his family, whose quiet kindness had never wavered. Elliot Reyes, who'd risked his own position to bring the truth to light. Even Sheriff Coburn, whose late but genuine courage had helped bring Victor Harlan's schemes to justice. Victor himself didn't attend, of course, though word reached them eventually of how his life had changed in the aftermath of that day. Stripped of much of his fortune, through the restitution he'd been forced to pay, he'd left the county entirely, settling somewhere in the territorial capital where his name carried less weight and less shame. Abigail felt no satisfaction in his downfall, no lingering desire for further vengeance. He'd made his choices, faced the consequences they deserved, and whatever life he built for himself afterward was no longer any concern of hers. Ash, for his part, became something of a local legend throughout the county, his story spreading far beyond the borders of their own small community. Ranchers from neighboring territories began seeking out Abigail's advice on horse breeding, curious about the bloodline that had produced an animal capable of surviving Widow's Ridge and Shale Pass despite injuries that should have ended him entirely. It was Caleb who finally traced the truth of Ash's origins, nearly a year after the race, through careful inquiry with old Mustang wranglers he'd known during his years in the high country. The bloodline ran back generations to mountain horses bred specifically for survival in the harshest terrain the territory had to offer. Animals selected not for beauty or speed alone, but for the kind of deep enduring strength that only revealed itself under genuine trial. "There's maybe a dozen horses left carrying that bloodline pure," Caleb told her, showing her the notes he'd compiled from his research. "Most folks lost track of the breeding decades back when fashion turned toward flashier, faster animals. Nobody wanted horses built for survival anymore. They wanted horses built for show. And Ash survived anyway. Abigail said, watching the horse graze peacefully in the pasture beyond healthy and strong, nothing left of the starving broken creature she'd bought for $40 all those months ago. Ash survived because somewhere along the way, generations of horses just like him proved that true value isn't always obvious at first glance, Caleb said. Sometimes it takes someone willing to look past the surface, past what everybody else has already decided to see what's actually there. They began breeding Ash carefully the following spring, selecting mares with careful attention to temperament and endurance, rather than simple market fashion, building something that honored both the horse's remarkable bloodline and the ranch's own history of resilience against impossible odds. Word spread slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, as ranchers throughout the territory began seeking out Heart Ranch horses specifically for their combination of endurance intelligence and quiet steady temperament. Within 2 years, the ranch that Victor Harlan had once dismissed as a dying legacy, worth nothing more than the land it sat on, had transformed into something entirely different. A respected breeding operation known throughout the territory, built not on flashy speed or expensive stock, but on the simple hard-won principle that true worth often lies hidden beneath surfaces too easily dismissed by those unwilling to look closer. Sarah Dawson, now a teenager with dreams of her own, spent every spare hour at the ranch, learning everything Abigail and Caleb could teach her about horses and breeding, and the patient work of building something lasting from nothing. "I want to do what you did," she told Abigail one afternoon, watching a new foal take its first wobbling steps in the pasture. "I want to look at something everybody else has given up on and see what they missed. Then you're already halfway there." Abigail told her, thinking of her own father, of the lessons he'd taught her about persistence and dignity that had carried her through the darkest months of her life. The hardest part isn't seeing the value others miss. It's having the courage to act on what you see, even when the whole world is laughing at you for trying. On the 3rd anniversary of the auction, where she'd bought Ash for $40, Abigail stood at the same fence line where she'd first seen him, starving and broken and dismissed by everyone around them, and watched him, now healthy, strong sire, to a growing line of horses that carried his remarkable bloodline forward into a new generation, that same quiet intelligence still visible in his eyes whenever he watched her approach. Caleb joined her there, their young daughter perched on his shoulders, laughing at the sight of the horses grazing peacefully in the autumn light. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked. "The auction, I mean. How different everything might have turned out if you'd walked past that pen without stopping." Abigail considered the question, watching Ash lift his head at the sound of their voices, ears pricked forward with the same alert curiosity he'd shown from that very first difficult day. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remember what my father always believed, even when the whole world seemed determined to prove him wrong. The land and the animals on it, and even the people passing through our lives, none of it rewards the strongest or the richest, or the ones who look most impressive on the surface." "What does it reward then?" Abigail smiled, watching their daughter reach down to pat Ash's neck as he approached the fence, gentle and patient, despite the small grasping hands. "It rewards the ones who take the time to see value where everybody else sees nothing," she said. "The ones willing to spend their last $40 on something the whole world has already given up on, because somewhere deep down they recognize a strength worth saving when they see it." The sun set slow and golden over land that had nearly been lost to greed and cruelty, now flourishing under the patient stewardship of a woman who'd refused to let the world's judgment define what she was capable of building. Ash grazed peacefully beside horses descended from his own remarkable bloodline, proof made flesh that the world's harshest verdicts are often nothing more than failures of imagination waiting to be proven wrong. And somewhere in that quiet, hard-won peace, the true legacy of the Hart Ranch finally revealed itself, not in silver buried beneath the ground, not in cattle counted or debts erased, but in the simple, unshakable truth that had carried Abigail through every dark night and every cruel word thrown her way since the day she'd raised her hand at that auction and changed everything. Sometimes the world's biggest failures are simply victories that nobody has bothered to recognize yet. And sometimes all it takes to change everything is one person brave enough to look closer, to reach out a steady hand, and to believe in something the rest of the world had already thrown away. That belief, more than any fortune or any legacy of land, was the truest inheritance Abigail Hart ever received from her father, and the one she would spend the rest of her life passing forward to every broken, discarded, underestimated soul brave enough to cross her path.